All right, hello everybody. Welcome to another session of the JavaScript Marathon on the Angular track. Today we're going to be talking about NgRx. Hopefully everybody here is excited. NgRx is a tool that I love using and I love talking about, and hopefully everyone will have a good time. For those of you that aren't familiar with me, my name is Rob O'Sell. I'm a software architect at this.labs. If you want to find me on Twitter, you can find me at RoboCell. So it's just my name with an extra L tacked onto it. You can ask the people over at the React track why that is. I've been telling the story a little bit this month, but suffice it to say, if you want to reach out to me after the session to ask any additional questions, or just sharing all the links that I share on Twitter, there you go. Before we really get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to some of our sponsors. So our first sponsor is this.labs. Your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. Find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Do you find keeping up with the constantly evolving technologies a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed on any of the latest technologies? This.labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. Contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. Also want to call some attention to some of our upcoming events that we host. Tune in to the every first Thursday of the month for the Angular Online Meetup. This.'s online meetups are an amazing opportunity for developers and enthusiasts alike to engage with the global tech community no matter where they are in the world. The next event is actually coming up on May 7th, so it's just in a couple weeks here. And for this event, This.' is partnering with Narwhal to present the state of NgRx with Brandon Roberts, Wes Grimes, and Mike Ryan from the NgRx core team going to be speaking. So if you're interested in that meetup or any of the future Angular meetups, you can register online at angularmeetup.com. Or if you're interested in React or just want to learn a little bit more about it, every second Thursday of the month, we have our global React meetup. If you're interested in that or what the next meetups are or who some of the upcoming speakers are, you can look for all of that and sign up online at reactjsmeetup.com. And every third Thursday of the month, we have our global Vue meetup. So same idea. If you want to look at who's speaking or sign up for future events, you can find that online at vuemeetup.com. Our final sponsor for today is Infragistics. Learn how to build better, faster Angular apps with Ignite UI. There are hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Angular native components, and charts and controls to make your development experience positive. Ignite UI is the developer's choice for Angular. Check out our sample apps and try Ignite UI for Angular for free at bit.ly/IgniteUI free trial. One other great thing is that we're actually pleased to be able to give a giveaway sponsored by Infragistics. So if you're interested in winning a 1-year license to Ignite UI for Angular, all you have to do is tweet about your favorite thing at this session. Okay, so tweet at this.media and at Infragistics using the hashtag JavaScript Marathon, and we're going to select one of those tweets to win a free 1-year license to Ignite UI. All right. Guate Dev, good to see you back. Thank you for coming back out for another session of the marathon. I'm glad that you enjoyed the Angular PWA session. Pato is a very energetic and enthusiastic speaker, and we were glad that he got to share his passion for PWA last week. So hopefully I can still maintain that high level of passion that you have come to expect from these sessions. All right, so today we're going to be talking about NgRx, not an introductory level course. So if you are here and you don't yet know what NgRx is or some of the patterns, this might not be the session for you, but you're more than welcome to listen. We will touch on some of the beginning ideas and concepts of NgRx, but what we're really talking about here is how to use NgRx more efficiently and more effectively on our projects. And that's really our goals. So our goals today are to really understand why it is that we use NgRx, and then we're going to go over some of the common pitfalls that teams often run into when using NgRx, and maybe some solutions on how we can fix that. There's probably going to be some time near the end for us to have sort of a free discussion. So if you all have any questions or things that you're struggling with, or if you have any pain points that you've experienced with NgRx that you'd like us to discuss, please put them in the chat. Be happy to call out to some of them. We'll see if we can make any progress on any of them. and really do this as like a collaborative exercise with one another. So the first thing that I want to focus on is this question of, is NgRx worth it, right? So many people these days are writing a lot of blog posts, not just about NgRx, but also about state management libraries such as Redux. They ask, is it worth it? Do you really need it? I feel like the poor NgRx core team is constantly having to go out to conferences and give that talk that basically is, you might not need NgRx. But why is it that we use this? Why is it that we want to use this? Why is it that here at this.labs, we really advocate for the use of it on many different projects? Well, obviously, the part that we like the most is that it's a great way to isolate our presentational elements from our business logic. We can somewhat start to tease apart those things which are presentational from those things which are concerned with making calls to the back end, of running a lot of complex validation, dealing with our real-time requirements, all the really complicated business features. We can start to take those apart and start to work on those on the side. NgRx also has the effect often of helping reduce the complexity and size of our components, right? Because again, we're taking a lot of that business logic out of our components, and we're just leaving behind what's actually necessary to drive those components. It's because of these two things that we find that NgRx on projects is actually really good for projects with junior developers. This is a bit counterintuitive. Some people like to say that NgRx can be really confusing for junior developers. But what we would argue is that on projects where a lot of care is given to how the NgRx setup is, on those projects, juniors really enjoy working with that technology and really enjoy using it because it allows them to so much more quickly build out components and see the actual effects. Then the seniors can come in and really work on some of those complex, as I said, real-time requirements or all the really complicated business requirements, and just give the juniors the correct connection points in order to actually, get things completely wired up. Another reason why NgRx is just really good and why we recommend it on a lot of Angular projects is because it, unlike so many other state management libraries, it is built very, very well as far as being connected to the framework in which it's used, right? So it's built on the same principles as Angular itself. We use these same kind of ideas of functional reactive programming. We're using RxJS, which we're using everywhere else. To me, having worked in multiple different frameworks with different state management libraries, I don't know that I've ever used a state management library or even any library that's as well suited for the framework in which it's used than NgRx. Now, it's a little bit funny for me to say that because I think the NgRx team has been doing a really good job of making sure that their software is in some ways not necessarily tied to Angular. It's just that it fits so well with Angular. It's not that it needs it. It's not that it requires it, but that it fits very well. Okay, so if NgRx is worth it, if we really think that it's valuable, but yet people still struggle with it, what is it that we need to do? What is it that's not happening that needs to be happening? And why is it that we're here today talking about this? Well, I would argue that it's incumbent on all of us here today learning about best practices to make sure that our teams are being a couple different things. So the first I would say is clear, right? We want to make sure that our teams are actually doing something which is obvious using our NgRx, okay? Oftentimes there can be a sense of wanting to make sure that things just work, right? Just get it to the point of working and then be done with it. But we want to make sure that what's happening is actually obvious, that it's readable, that it's understandable, that it's maintainable. We also want our teams to be consistent, right? We want our teams to be doing the same thing from component to component, from action to action, and effect to effect. Even if those things might be considered suboptimal based on whatever the zeitgeist of the NgRx community or Redux community is at that time, as long as your team is being consistent, your overall code is going to be more understandable and more maintainable. And the last thing, and I preach this a lot with a lot of teams that I work with, is this idea of being intentional. So again, sometimes it can feel like when you are coding in a complex situation that you are like a firefighter that has a hold of the hose, right? And if you've ever seen like the cartoons that this, right, the hose is like swinging back and forth, right? And they're not getting any water on the fire at all. It's sort of a comedy thing with cartoons. I feel like sometimes in web development, no matter how senior you are, no matter whether you're an architect, I get this way too. Sometimes you just need to solve a problem, and things keep coming up that you just don't understand, you don't understand, and you just feel like you're holding on to the end of that hose, and you just don't have control over it. And what tends to come out of that is code that is not intentional. It's doing what it needed to do to maybe work, but it's not stating strongly what its ideas of what its input should be, what its outputs should be, or what it's trying to do. And I think as long as we are constantly asking ourselves if we're being clear, consistent, and intentional in the way that we construct our NgRx, then I think we can stop our NgRx problems or our NgRx implementation from getting out of hand and being those kind of negative experiences that people sometimes talk about. This is because when done poorly, I think solutions like NgRx can actually become worse than not having it at all. So this is not a situation where its worst case scenario is that it's about the same as having it or not having it. It can actually be the case that if you're not being mindful of your architecture with NgRx, it can actually make things harder to maintain and harder to understand. I don't want this to scare you. This is not a fault of NgRx. It's not an inherent fault of Redux. It's just that powerful tools can have powerful effects. If you are not using them correctly, you will not get out of it what you expect to get out of it, right? It's just like functions. Garbage in, garbage out. Powerful tools are the same way. If you use powerful tools badly, then you're going to not like the results that come out of it. Okay, so let's start on that process, right, of getting our code and our projects to be more intentional, to be more clear and more consistent. So to do that, I think we all need to get on the same page with a couple of definitions and a couple of ideas and a couple of architectural principles, because these become the things that we will refer back to so often. So the first is this idea of coupling. Hilariously, over the course of my career, I've heard a million different definitions for the idea of coupling. I don't even know that I have the right definition, but I've heard a lot of them, some that I think are more right than others. And the definition of coupling that I want to talk about is this idea of when a piece of code knows specifically that another piece of code exists and how to use it, that those two things are then coupled, at least coupled in one direction. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. Here's an example, right? We have an update interface function that has that makes a call out to another method. And it's going to pass some parameters, and then that's going to that second method is going to return a string. Okay, so what is true of this method? This method is sort of got like a one-way coupling, right? Update interface knows of the existence of print greeting. It knows that method exists. It knows what its API is, and it actually invokes that method. So it is tightly coupled in the sense of it needs to know if something changes about that method. If it changes name, if it changes its parameters, it needs to be updated. It is coupled. But print greeting doesn't know who called it. Okay, it just takes some parameters and then it just returns something. It doesn't care who calls it, doesn't care when they call it, doesn't care why or in what ways. It just says, I'm here, you can invoke me. So they're not coupled to each other. Now let's compare that with something like this, which I don't think anybody would really be doing this, but let's talk about this version. So here we're actually passing the original, the original encased the surroundings of the function, right, through this, right? So we're taking the lexical scope of this, passing it into print greeting. So what happens here? Here, update interface knows about print greeting because it knows to actually pass it in. But print greeting now has this sort of interesting thing where it knows the thing that it's being passed, and it knows it has a property called first, and it knows it has a property called last. Now, in some ways, this is when you pass any object to a method, right? I'm not saying that objects are what couple things, but here it's a little bit stronger idea than that. The idea here is that both sides of this know about each other, and we would call this kind of thing tightly coupled. Here is the loosest level of coupling. So here, update interface doesn't know about print greeting, but it does know that it wants to trigger some sort of event. It's going to some third party and telling them, hey, I might need help with something. And the other side of this, the print greeting, says, hey, third party, I'm interested when things happen of a certain type. And in this case, it's this updated event. And now you see here that these two things are not coupled to one another anymore because neither of them knows of the existence of the other one. It doesn't know, the thing that's listening to events doesn't know if anybody's generating events. The generator doesn't know if anybody's listening to events, but they do know that there is some event infrastructure going. So in that way, each of these things is now coupled to the event service, but neither of them is coupled to each other. And this ends up being, again, the most potent idea, one of the most potent ideas of Redux infrastructure, architecture in general, and NgRX in specific, is that this is really how we are starting to separate these concepts. This is what we mean when we say we separate the concerns of the presentation from the business logic. We are uncoupling these things. We are decoupling them, right? We are taking the components, we're having them say, okay, I know somebody cares about what's happening, what users are doing with me, but I don't know who is. I'm not calling them directly, but I'm letting people know that something important might have happened. And other people are saying, hey, when important things happen, I want to be activated. I don't know where those important things necessarily happened. I don't necessarily know when or how or which particular component, if you were A/B testing, right? But I know an important thing happened, I'm going to react to it. And it's that decoupling that gives so much of the power of this architecture. So we also talk about concepts like functional reactive programming. I'm only going to touch on this very briefly, but this idea of functional versus imperative. Imperative saying, I want this thing to do this command in this way. It's very equivalent to this idea of calling, of performing particular algorithms, of calling particular methods to do specific things. Functional style, a little bit more declarative. You're kind of saying what it is you want to do, but not necessarily directly specifying exactly how it should proceed. And then reactive programming, this idea of everything in your application being this sequence of events, right? We will statically render a page, and then unless something happens in our application, a statically rendered page has no reason to ever change. So it's really events in our system. It's those clicks, it's those button presses, it's those timers, it's those WebSockets. It's all of these events which cause changes in our architecture and in our application. And Angular's just been built on this since day one, right, with RxJS, that modeling our applications as sequences of, or as collections of events that are occurring that we want to handle in declarative ways. That's core to Angular, that's core to a really scalable, maintainable front-end architecture, and that's really core to NgRX. Okay, the last concept that I want to talk about, and I think this is a concept that not as many people talk about anymore. They just skip directly to the state management without realizing that this is the alternative, right? So when people tell you that you may not need NgRX, oftentimes this is what they mean, is that you might be able to use a simpler form of unidirectional data flow to help manage your state. So unidirectional data flow is this idea that data flows down and events flow up, okay? So this means that you can own a piece of data in your parent. In the picture that you're seeing here, A owns a piece of data. And instead of B also getting that piece of data, say from an API or from wherever, it instead accepts that data as an argument from A. And then when somebody wants to edit that data, instead of editing it in place, therefore causing it to become out of sync and certainly being confusing to maintainers of your software why your data is being edited all over the place, it events that something important happened to its parent, A. A then updates that piece of data and then passes that data back down. Okay, this is the rudiments of the modern component-based front-end frameworks. This is true of Vue. This is true of React. This is true of Angular. This is true of probably all of them. This idea of unidirectional data flow, it is the fundamental piece of data management, state management. So why then do we use NgRX, or what eventually led to the creation of things like Redux or the Flux pattern in general? And it's this idea of, sometimes data is needed all over your application. And when data is needed in two different places in your application, we already talked about how you could hoist that data up to its parent and give it down. But what if that component that needs it is all the way on the other side of your application? Well, in that case, you have to do this idea of data hoisting, and prop drilling is what the original patterns were called, which is this idea that if you want to have a single owner for data, you need to raise that piece of data all the way up to the first common ancestor of all the people that need it. Now, in some cases, that's only moving it up one level. In some cases, that's moving it up two levels. It really depends on your application and the piece of data. For something that's really global, like maybe the authentication state, that is probably the root. So that state would go all the way up to your root. Your root would manage that. And then it would pass that data all the way down to all of its children. And if anything needed to happen that would have affected that data, it would have to event to the child, event from the child to all of its parents, all the way up to the root. The root would update the data, and then it would flow all the way back down, right? For sufficiently large enough quantities of global state, this becomes an untenable pattern. And this is why the flux pattern, in part, was created. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the strongest reasons why it was created. And so certain pieces of state like this tend to be good things to elevate up to our global store. And this is kind of how we start to build things up. So you can always think about state management as store it locally if you can in your component, hoist it if it only needs to go up or down a little bit using the principles of unidirectional data flow. And if you find that you're using the piece of data everywhere and you keep having to lift it higher and higher, then make it part of your global store or make it part of a local store, right? There are different ways that you can begin to kind of move into this piece by piece. All right, the last sort of introduction to the architectural concepts that I want to go over is this idea of publish subscribe. So the publish subscribe architectural pattern is powerful. It's been used on backends forever. It's been used on front ends to a reasonable degree, but it's been used on the back end a lot. So if you've been working on microservices with message passing, or I mean, honestly, any system for a long time, you might have encountered this pattern. So in the publish subscribe architecture, there's a publisher, which kind of indicates something of interest has occurred. There's a subscriber who has stated a desire to know when something interesting has occurred. And there's this idea of an event bus, right? This component that accepts notices from publishers and then alerts subscribers. The event bus allows those communications between those components without coupling them. This goes back to that example from earlier that we gave of coupling. And this is basically what NgRx is doing and Redux is doing when implemented correctly. So there's a really great talk by Izan Alaboudi. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. We can include the link in the notes for this video as well. But he gives a really good description of how there are some really common pitfalls that people get into when they look at Flux style state management patterns, when they don't think of them like publish subscribe. And we're going to be talking about this a fair bit today, so I needed to bring this up. But here's an example that they give of a really well-functioning publish subscribe system. So you can see you have a system, and that system is going to indicate some sort of event to the message bus. And then you have many different services on the other side of that message bus, those subscribers, listening to the exact same event and doing something. This is a really good thing because it scales really well. If you need to change the way that the email service responds to that event, you can change it in one place. It's an isolated deployment. It's an isolated fix. It has isolated impacts to the rest of the system. If you want to add an additional service, you can do that without having to change the publisher or the other subscribers. If you want to remove one, right? Add, remove, subtract, whatever you want to do, make it arbitrarily more complicated. You can do all of that without having to affect anything outside of the code which actually needs to be affected. It's incredibly powerful. Now, when you look at people that have poor NgRx usage in their teams, it often will tend to look like this, where it started off well-intentioned, where they dispatched some sort of action, and then they maybe have an effect that was listening to that action, but then they needed to do something else. And instead of just tacking on to the existing action, because they named that action in a way that didn't really seem like they could extend it, then they create a situation where they have to dispatch another action to get a different effect, and another action to get a different effect. And suddenly, whenever a user clicks a button, you dispatch like 3 or 4 separate actions, or maybe conditionally dispatch them. And you start to realize that the more complicated your use case and your logic gets, you're not being saved anywhere. You're having to make this change in multiple different places all at the same time. And you might find out that you think that just sounds like invoking functions with extra steps, right? This is where NgRx goes really badly. You haven't decoupled anything. You've actually left them completely coupled with one another, but you've left them coupled through the bridge of the message bus. So you have somebody dispatching an action which is known to be listened to by a particular subscriber to achieve a certain effect. It's basically the same thing as making a method call. These projects tend to be the ones where people feel like, why am I doing this? Everything feels so indirect. I have to have all these files open. It's so confusing to learn what's going on. Hey, Raphael, glad to see that you're here. And this is the crux of the issues that people face. Okay, so that's a lot of architectural introduction. I'm gonna take a sip of water here, give you guys a chance. If there's any questions about any of this architectural stuff before we dig into the actual concrete stuff of NgRX. Okay. So when we're looking at some of the common pitfalls here for NgRX, I've sort of bracketed them into a couple different topics. There's many of them, but these are some of the ones that I see a lot. The first is this idea of bloated stores, putting way too much into the store and feeling like everything has to be in the store. And that really putting you in shackles when you try to figure out how to build new components. Well, hopefully, Mehdi, that we'll be able to give you some actionable advice that we can work on for your team. The second is too few selectors. So people aren't leveraging selectors nearly well enough. And this means that they tend to pull too much of the store into their components or into their effects. And while this may or may not have performance implications, it kind of does, it'll also create a situation where it's really hard to unit test some of this stuff because you have access to the entire store. So we're not leveraging selectors nearly well enough. And it might be the case that instead of building selectors, we're storing too much duplicate data into the store. Another is command-based actions and reused actions. If you've listened to any talks by the NgRX core team, they harp on this all the time, that you want to be using event-based actions. We'll talk about that. Number 4 is something that I call effect dominoes, which are actions which trigger effects, which trigger actions, which trigger effects, which trigger actions, which trigger effects. And we'll talk about what that looks like. Selector-based effects, something which could seem pretty benign and innocent, but actually can lead to a lot of nasty regressions in your code. And then lastly, overly smart components. This is where we're going to bring the idea of coupling back in and talk about why it is that overly smart components, where smart means that they either are subscribed to the store when they could have gotten that data from their parent, or that they know exactly what's going to happen after they dispatch an action, why those things cause some problems for you. So we'll talk about data in our bloated stores. It's really hard to give concrete understandings of what data to put into the store, because again, I think, if you start from a reasonable standpoint that nothing should be in the store unless it proves itself to need to be in the store, you're probably in the right spot, rather than to put everything in the store and then pull it out as it becomes problematic. Probably better to default to putting nothing there, and to promote things as they show that they're needed. But if you look in the documentation for NgRX, they talk about the shari or the sherry principle for data, which is data should go in your store, which is shared. That's the S, is shared state that is accessed by many different components and services. So that's that global idea, right? If you need a piece of data all over your application, probably good to put in your store. H is for hydrated. So state that is persisted and rehydrated from external storage. So this is data that you spent some effort to try and get from somewhere else, and so you hold on to it. A is for available, state that needs to be available when re-entering routes, right? So this idea of persistence, you could put it in the store and it will survive even when your components disappear or are unmounted. R is retrieved, so state that must be retrieved with a side effect. So anything which is going to be affected by our side effects actually needs to be in the store, because the only way that we're going to be able to get data from our effects to our components is via the store. So we have to store the results of that in our store. And the I stands for impacted, so state that is impacted by actions from other sources. Okay. I'll give you guys another one. So this was mine. My personal one is a DUGSA. I don't really mean for people to read it out like that, but the D is for depended on. So this is data which is actually needed, again, needed by effects and actions and things such as that. The U is for unique. So you always want to look for data. You want to keep data in the store which cannot be derived from other data. So this is actually a principle not to determine what to put into a store, but what to take out. If data can be derived from other data already in the store, then it shouldn't be there. It should be a selector instead. The G is global, again, data which is needed everywhere. The S is serializable, so we want to make sure that what we put into the store can actually be written out as JSON, as something which is serializable. We want to try to not put model objects and things of that nature into our store, or complex binary entities. We want to try and find ways around that. And the A is atomic. So this is a really fascinating one, which we will not get into a ton here, but it goes into this idea of state machines. State machines is something that I really love a lot. And oftentimes, multiple pieces of data will actually change in concert with one another, even though they are not the same piece of data. They mean something different. So they are unique, but they actually vary together in interesting ways. And oftentimes, that's a signal to us that we can actually replace that piece of data with a state machine or a state property, and then derive the more unique pieces of data in selectors. So you want to be looking for data in your store which is actually atomic, so it'll change by itself, and not necessarily have a lot of data which always changes together, like a lot of binary flags or something, like is loading, is error, is canceled, blah, 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 blah. If you have a lot of these properties which seem to be bound basically from the same, they move together and in concert with one another, that's a sign of data that can get out of sync with itself, so you want to try and move that out. So that's the store, and again, there's no magic here. If you all have any questions about data, like something that you hate to put into your stores, or something that you have a question, like you put it into your store but you don't know whether it belongs there or not, feel free to ask in the chat and we can address that. Okay. So the next one is too few selectors. Here, my advice is to prefer specific selectors. So specific selectors are selectors which only bring the data that they really need to be meaningful and interesting, right? Because the alternative is that you have a selector which takes the entire store and just returns the whole store. This is often not the most useful thing. It also makes your tests really hard to write and maintain, and it just makes your code harder to use, right? If you give other developers a set of selectors that are very focused to accomplish their goals, it's going to be a lot clearer to them how they're actually meant to accomplish certain things and get certain pieces of data than it is if you just give them access to the entire store and they have to go and maybe not realize that you've given them some sort of helpful utility or things along those lines. We want to make sure that we're composing selectors. So many of you may or may not know this, that you can build selectors that are based off of other selectors in NgRX. This is super powerful because you can just make selectors that are more specific. And the example that I want to give here, which is really, really cool, is I was working with a client once and we had a lot of nested selectors. So we had kind of like a selector at a top level, which was doing a repackaging of some data, and then a bunch of selectors below it, which were grabbing pieces of that data and maybe doing additional management. Now, what happened was we changed the way that the top level data object was constructed. We moved the data all over the place. It was coming from completely different sources. So what was really cool about this is that when it came time to make that update, instead of having to update every single component and every single selector to look to the new data, we added an additional selector, which basically repackaged all the new data into the format which was very similar to the old data format. So then the selector below it could now read from that data and never had to change, and all the selectors below it never had to change, and all the components never had to change, and all the tests never had to change. What a powerful refactoring concept that you can do that. So always compose your selectors if your selectors are part of another selector that already exists. If they are a subset of an existing selector, try to reuse those existing selectors, because you will thank yourself later when you make one good change somewhere higher up in your selector tree and it automatically propagates everywhere below it. So, so good. We'll take a second here to answer a question. So Shamir says, should filtered or sorted data be put into the store? From my understanding, it could be considered derived data. Yes, that would be my understanding as well, that filtered and sorted data should be in like a selector. So you can build a selector. Let's put a selector up on screen. You can build a selector which is going to depend on two different selectors, right? One is the set of results, and the other is the sort order. Now, let's assume for the moment that your store can actually hold all the results, because if you're talking about pagination, this is a totally different concept. But if you're not talking about pagination, if you have all the results and it's just a matter of filtering and sorting, that, yeah, you would basically have in your store via some selector, the sort order or the filter string. And then you would have a selector which actually pulls in the results, and it pulls in the sort or the filter, and then it returns the filtered or sorted results. And what's great about NgRX is that that's going to give you a memoized selector, meaning that it's not going to constantly recalculate it unless the inputs change. So you get you don't store redundant data in your store, and you get incredible performance improvements from not having to constantly recalculate the selectors as well. So you're 100% correct. That is derived data. So I would do that as a selector. Okay. So I want to show some examples of really cool selectors that showcase some of the things that I suggest that teams do. And these come from a buddy of mine, Wes Grimes, who's on the NgRX core team. At least I hope he considers me to be his buddy. I consider him to be mine. He has a really cool application, which we will hopefully have time to look at later. If not, I will pass some of the links on to you guys, at least just show you what they are. And I think he showcases some of the great things that selectors can do. So he has an example code for uploading files. And so he built some utility methods like this, which, ostensibly their sole purpose is to get back a file size, to do conversions or formatting of data. Here, we're actually using a selector. Well, it's not a selector yet, but we eventually will turn it into a selector, this idea of converting some piece of state in your store into even a class to be shown on in your HTML. And this is the one that I think is really cool, which is this idea of having model objects. So many of us use model objects in our code, to wrap our API data with. And it might have utility methods and things like that, which makes our code a lot easier to use in our components. And those are totally fine. You don't have to get rid of those, but don't put those in your store. Because they're not easily serializable, and it'll actually violate some of the checks that they have. So instead, if you want to wrap data from your store into a model object, do it with a selector. And when you do that with a selector, again, you get all the benefits of memoization, but you also get that better API that your models create, and your store stays serializable. And your model objects don't have to be unique, right? You can have redundant data formatted in different ways in your model object, however you want to handle your model objects, but you can actually build them with selectors. And I think that is something that a lot of teams don't do. They just put their model objects directly into the store. Try to store just the JSON or the individual components of the data in your store instead, and then construct the model objects with selectors. And this is just, we showed this earlier, this was just how you actually turned that into a selector, right? So this selector is based off of this existing selector. So again, always be composing your selectors when you can. You can compose arbitrarily many, well, not arbitrarily many, but you can compose many selectors together to get all of their data separately, and then return a single result out. Incredibly powerful, smaller selectors that are based on other selectors. This is one of the greatest performance impacts of NgRX. It's part of what makes it so amazing and so cool and so fun to use and so testable is this. And I really want teams to be leveraging this if they're not already. Don't just pull directly from the store. Try to always use selectors and never pull from the store if you can avoid it as a general rule. And then make sure that your selectors always pull from a higher level selector if they're proper subsets of that selector. All right. So we've talked about actions being events and not commands. This goes back to this concept of talking about pub/sub, publish/subscribe architectures. This talks about the unidirectional data flow, right? Actions are us signaling to the owner of data that something interesting has happened that it might want to respond to. This is why we spent all that time talking about architecture, because this is the primary justification for why actions, what NgRX calls actions, are supposed to be events, and they're not meant to be commands, right? We don't want to dispatch actions like save result or open modal. We want to talk about what buttons did the user click, what text did the user enter, what flow did they begin, what conceptual event just occurred. These types of things all are the types of things that we want to build our actions out of, and then allow through NgRX our many different effects to respond to those events in all the varied ways that they need to. So one thing that I want to stress here is that a lot of people are taught dry programming. So if you're in chat and you've heard of dry programming, let me know. let me know if you've heard of dry programming or if you try to be dry on your projects. So I think oftentimes dry is the correct principle when you're developing software. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself. And this is generally something that we want to do in our code, but it comes with a pretty significant caveat, which is that when you do it with NgRx, you can actually create a situation that works counter to the intention of the architecture. Repeating and reusing too much code in NgRx can actually lead to code which has a lot of regressions and is more difficult to maintain. So I like to talk about AHA programming, which is a Kent C. Dodds-ism. AHA programming, which means avoiding hasty abstractions. But it's this idea that if actions should be unique. Events are unique, right? A user clicking a particular button versus a similarly named button on another view. These are unique events. Each of them is similar in what they will trigger, but they are unique in the context in which they occurred. So that context is important. And we should not just assume that one save button is the same as another save button. The differences in those buttons can oftentimes be important, and therefore actions themselves should be unique. It's cheap to make actions with NgRx, especially with the new syntax, and we should take advantage of that. I also want to talk about this idea of one event being one action. So I don't know if anybody here has this in their apps or seen it before, but a lot of times you'll see it on like a submit of a long form. It might have many different entities inside of it. And in the submit method, you'll see store.dispatch, save this entity, store.dispatch, save this entity, store.dispatch, save this entity. And one button click by the user will result in like 5 things showing up in the NgRx dev tools going across through the wire. And this is going to be a signal to you that you are violating this idea, that you did not actually signal an event, you were sending out commands because you felt compelled to send more than one. If one event occurs, it should be one action, period. And that never changes. It might ripple through the effects and cause multiple follow-on actions, but one click, one type, one operation, one action. So here's an example of that. This is just basically what I just said. So if somebody submits a form to put some to-dos in, they might go, oh, I need to post the to-do, and I need to open a toast, and I need to go to the dashboard. And they go dispatch, dispatch, dispatch. And then I'm going to go have effects that post the to-do, that open the toast, that navigate to the dashboard. And I feel like I've done it, and I'm really, really good. But again, this is making some of your code and your actions much harder to understand, and your flows much harder to understand. Because if you ever arrive at the open toast action, you're like, well, how many different places is this used? Where is it dispatched from? What if I want to change what happens when a toast is opened to have another step that happens before it? Is that okay every single place that I'm showing a toast to have that occur? Is it not? When you make your actions super, super, super specific, you lose that functional programming style, that declarative style, that ability to change and adapt what it means to respond to those events. You've made it too imperative. You've switched from the declarative mode to the imperative mode. You've specified exactly what needs to happen. You've removed all that flexibility. Again, you go back to having things which are tightly coupled, but they're tightly coupled through the indirection of NgRx, which is the worst of both worlds. So instead, the bottom version is what we would more want to do, which is just to submit, dispatch, say like a to-do is submitted, and then we will, in an effect, handle the fact that it has to be saved on the server, the fact that I might have to open a toast, the fact that I might have to navigate to a different page, right? All of that can happen elsewhere, and my component doesn't need to know. My component just tells me something interesting happened. You probably care. Somewhere else, somebody is deciding what it means to respond to that interesting thing happening. Again, that's the power. Now, if you're struggling with coming up with the right types of actions, you may consider event storming. Event storming is a really cool name that I got from Mike Ryan, which talks about ways to look at a design with a team and figure out what kind of actions might make it up. So this picture is not quite as big as I might like it to be. So hopefully you guys are working on large screens here. But here is the Spotify UI. And what is really fun to do with your team is when you get designs from your designer is to open up your designs and sit down as a team and do an event storm. So what is an event storm? It's to go through this UI and decide what are all the different things which a user can do or that might occur that I might need to model as actions. So, just darting around, because this would be hard to do as action because of the delay, but here I see a volume slider. So a user deciding to change the volume. I might have some sort of numerical value for that value changing. I could mute or unmute a stream, which might be interesting. I can like or favorite a particular song, also interesting. I can track to a particular time on the timeline. Or here's another one. What happens when the timer actually runs out? So even though the user doesn't cause it, the song ending is itself an event, because that event I might want to listen to and then queue up the next song. So what happens there, right? And then it determines, enabling shuffle or disabling shuffle. And then that's interesting because whether shuffle is enabled or not will change what happens when a song ends. Similarly, the next button, right? What happens with the next button is different depending on what other pieces of state are sent. So you can start to see how this would fall into an NgRx layout. And we just keep looking for more actions. So I can pause a song. I can pause a song again here. I could pause a song again here. And then there are other things like creating a playlist. Now, creating a playlist doesn't actually send you to a different page. Creating a playlist prompts you, sends up a modal, and then creates that playlist for you. So we could have an event of clicking on this creating of a playlist, and then the effect is going to show the modal and then ultimately create the playlist, right? So you would just do this as a team. And what's great about that is not only are you creating better events because you're not thinking about what things do I want to happen when I pause, but instead what ways can a user or what events can actually occur in this app. There's a whole other set of apps, by the way, or events that we haven't talked about with respect to as pieces of the song come down, errors in the socket which is sending down the songs, et cetera, et cetera. Not only are you doing better because you're always thinking in terms of events and not in terms of things you want to happen in response to the events, but you're also helping your team to get better at using NgRx because you're doing this as a group exercise. You're checking each other's instincts. You're negotiating out what some of these event APIs are going to be. And then you can then separate out from there. One set of people can go off and build the UI that actually dispatches those events. Another set of people can go off and build all the effects that actually rely on those events. And you don't actually have to have those two teams coupled together. You can have all of that work in parallel with one another using mock objects with mock selectors, because again, you might decide what the selectors in the shape of the store was going to be. Then you can have mocked out selectors, while the other side is actually building up all the reducers and all the effects. This is the incredible power of NgRx. But you really need to use the architecture correctly to see those benefits. And event storming, if your team doesn't feel confident avoiding situations, as we showed in the previous step, where they're just dispatching too many things. If you ever see more than one dispatch in the same method that isn't in an effect, it's a problem. And you should talk about it as a team to figure out ways to refactor that. And if you see that you're struggling with that over and over as a team, really use this approach to help teach the team and get better at doing this, right? It's not a natural thing. We don't naturally think in terms of reactive programming. We honestly often feel we are taught to be very imperative in our programming styles, and I think that's a more natural frame for developers. So just be mindful of that. Okay, so let's talk about effect dominoes. Effect dominoes are actions which are dispatched, which trigger effects, which dispatch actions, which trigger effects, which dispatch actions, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And sometimes you can turn a single event, a user pressed a single button, into dozens, or I've seen hundreds of entries in your NgRx dev tool logs, because these things can just go out exponentially and grow. Now, generally speaking, these effect dominoes, as I'll show you what I mean, but this idea happens when you've switched to using imperative action-based commands instead of and reusing effects. So this is all a form of premature abstraction, right? You're like, oh, hey, one of my effects saves a piece of data and another effect saves the same piece of data. rather than call a particular or just copy the code between those two effects, I'm going to create an action which is called save piece of data to the server, and it's going to have an effect which does that shared piece of code. Actions and effects can often be bad ways to promote code reuse in your NgRX code. That's not how you're meant to split up effects. When you want to reuse something like that, it's not usually the best to do that, but instead to turn them into methods or service calls or utilities. So again, this is where intention comes in. Make sure that if you're going to abstract something into a separate action and a separate effect, that you do it with intent, that you do it because the two things that are going to dispatch that similar action and have that similar effect are intended to be the same. You want them to always do the same thing. No matter how they change, you always want them to do the same thing, not just that they happen to be doing the same thing now. Coincidence is a bad basis for abstraction. All right, so how would we fix this? We would replace these chains with longer effects that can take care of entire independent side effects. And then you can use a general rule. So here's the general rule that I like to say on my teams, is that you can have an action which can trigger one or more events. Okay, so there's no limit on the number of events, or excuse me, effects. You can trigger as many effects as you want in response to an action, but each of those effects is only allowed to dispatch an action which can reduce. So you think about this with like a call to a server, right? Some action can be dispatched. That dispatched action can trigger an effect. That effect can make a call to, say, an API. And then when that data comes back from the API, we need to get it into the store. So it's allowed to dispatch that final action, which will get that data into the store. Now, are there reasons to violate this? Yes, there are reasons to violate this rule, but a lot of teams are looking for a heuristic that they can give to the people that are less confident in how to work with this code. That is my heuristic. Allow actions to be dispatched which trigger effects, which are allowed to dispatch one more action that can only reduce. It can't have its own effect. Again, there are valid reasons to break this, but for teams that don't have the confidence to know when it's okay to break that, or might lose control of it without a level of flexibility, use that heuristic. It'll really help your team. So here's an example of the types of effect dominoes, or at least one slice of an effect domino. So here we have an effect that is looking for some to-dos that are created, and then it's going to do a bunch of different things simultaneously. It's going to post the to-do. Maybe it has like a topic, and we need to post the topic if the topic is unique because we store the topic separately from the to-dos for some reason in this app. And then we need to like listen for the to-do success, and if the to-do success comes back, then we log the actions, and then we show the toast, right? So you have this really complicated effect. It has like this sort of multi-layered effect to it where it actually then listens to a follow-up action and then does additional effects. This is like all with 4 or 5 different actions being dispatched. Log action might be being used in multiple places. Post topic might be being used in different places. And you just don't know if that code is actually properly shared. I've often seen people go in and change the code in a flow of one of these utility actions, I'll call them. And I've seen them change the way that that utility action is processed and unknowingly, unintentionally breaking another page that they weren't even thinking about because they just happen to rely somewhere in those domino chains. They happen to rely on the same action and the same effect, but they expected it to do different things. And so a change that seemed safe to make was no longer safe, and that actually caused bugs. So again, we want to leverage independent effects here. That's one way to break up these dominoes. Figure out where your effects are actually independent, and you can handle them differently, independent of one another. Consider controlling your global UI from these effects, and then otherwise just sort of unwind it. So here is a light refactoring of the same situation. So here we now have an effect, and it still listens to do created, but instead of actually triggering these utility actions, instead it just calls the service and actually does the post itself. So here it might post the to-do, it might post the topic. When both of those come back, we might post some, dispatch some action called post to-do success and pass in the result so that that result can get into the local store. You know, all of these things we can do. And what's nice is now this code is unique. It's not prematurely abstracted. We have actually made this code, this effect, be what we want it to be, and it does a very specific task. But then we've taken off the parts which are both generic and independent and split them off into their own effects. So if we want to do the logging, instead of dispatching an additional log action, instead what we'll do is we'll just add the original action type, or the particular action type of interest, to the list of actions that can trigger that effect here. So you could imagine that this of type would be much longer in this real application because there'd be other actions that also caused logs to occur. But, oh, interesting, I've refactored this again, and then I forgot to make sure that the message was passed in. Well, there you go. This is what happens sometimes when you are preparing examples. But so you would have to fix this bug. But other than the bug in log action or in show toast, you can see that this is how we would reuse effects if necessary, by actually hanging the actions that are triggering those effects directly on those actions. Okay. So let's talk about effects based on selectors. Let's talk about what that causes. So here is an example of a effect that might be based on a selector. So in this case, let me take a moment here to answer Nilesh. How to avoid concurrent execution of two effects having persistence or navigation in both effects. So you have to ask yourself, what is actually happening in that effect? Why is it that two separate things that you consider to be independent could be having effects on the same data? If it is true that the two effects could potentially destructively interfere with one another, then they aren't actually independent. They're actually one effect, and you should write them as one effect, and not write them as one effect that has two utility actions, which I've mentioned before, because again, that level of deconstruction will create things that you think are reusable but turn out to not be in the future. The second answer to your question is how to deal with, say, dependency order, right? Where I have independent effects, but they need to happen one after the other. The way that you handle that is, generally speaking, by adding more actions which signify that an effect has completed. So when an effect has completed, it's totally fine to register an action to indicate that that effect is completed and to tie the completion of that effect to the start of follow-on effects. So if they form like a then B relationship, you do it that way. If they don't, if it's just that these two things are more connected than I thought they were, they seemed independent, but they're not independent, then model them as one effect and make that effect as long as it needs to be. Again, don't prematurely abstract. Make your effects gross and long if they have to be gross and long. And then figure out later on, looking at all the effects you have, where are ways that you can reuse code intentionally. That would be my suggestion. Let me know if that makes sense. So with these selector-based effects, the major problem that we have here is here we're kind of looking at a different way to do updating to-dos on the server. So here, instead of listening to some sort of like to-dos updated action, instead it's actually subscribed to the store, and it is listening to when the to-dos selector emits a new value. And when the to-dos selector emits a new value, it then goes to the server and updates those to-dos. Now, I've seen extremely intelligent, extremely senior, well-intentioned developers run into this problem. And what the problem here is, and you might be sitting there going, I don't even know what's wrong with this. I do this all the time. You think it's being clever because it's capturing not only when to-dos are added, but it's also capturing when to-dos are deleted. It's also capturing when to-dos are edited. And you're like, wow, I got multiple different user flows captured with a single effect. I have earned my pay. I have reduced the lines of code. My code is less complex. But it's actually not true. Selectors as the basis of effects is incredibly confusing because selectors being updated are actually responses to actions themselves, right? Actions are reduced, new state being reduced updates selectors. And so when those selectors change and they update effects, what we have is ultimately an idea that a certain action triggered an effect. but you've done it sort of indirectly. And what happens over time is those actions, you don't know, first of all, those actions trigger this effect because there's no easy way to trace them. There's no easy way to know that a particular action is going to affect a piece of state, which is going to trigger another effect. But more so than that, you lose track of, in the future, if you change those actions to no longer affect that state, or you change other actions to now affect that state, you will suddenly start seeing effects not happening or effects triggering unnecessarily, and not know, because this code isn't self-documenting, you won't know whether you meant to do that or not. You'll be looking around wondering why a certain effect isn't happening. And then you look and you see that it's based on a particular piece of state changing, and you're like, oh my God, why isn't that state changing anymore? Wait, what actions were intended to change the state? Are more doing this unnecessarily? Are some not doing it that are supposed to be doing it? And you will surprise yourself how quickly you'll forget which actions are meant to be combined here into this one selector. So please, there might be a valid reason to use a selector in an effect. To be honest, I have not seen one. Do not do it. Make your effects based on actual events, usually to the initial causes of those events, which means either the actions that triggered them, or again, something else like router events or WebSocket updates, things that you can get a hold of, but always trace to the first cause, to the initial cause of the user interaction or the automatic update that occurred, right? Don't try to trace off of intermediate cause and effects. If you do that, you're going to really cause yourself pain in the future when you just can't understand how one action eventually propagates to effects and side effects and other types of things, because you're going to have to catch, okay, so this action, I dispatched it, it reduced, it affected those pieces of state. For every one of the pieces of state that it affected, are there effects that are listening to changes in that pieces of state? If so, what do they do? What actions do they dispatch? What state do those actions affect? What effects are triggered by changes in that state? And it can also be really easy to have effects which trigger themselves accidentally because they change a piece of code or trigger an action, which then writes to the same piece of data, which updates the same selector, which then re-triggers the effect. I've seen a lot of people get messed up with selector-based effects. You don't want to mess with them if you can avoid them. The final thing that I want to talk about is this idea of making fewer, dumber components. And this is basically me making a plea for avoiding subscribing to the event stream and components. This goes back to this idea of coupling. So, many of you might be here and you dispatch an action, and then in that component, you then listen to the action stream and you listen for the success pair to that action. So you say, like, you dispatch forms submitted, and then you immediately subscribe to the store and you listen for form submitted success. And then you do something thereafter. I will make the argument that that is tightly coupling, or not tightly coupling, but certainly coupling the component back to the store. When you resubscribe to the action stream, listening for a particular action to come back over the wire in your component, what you're effectively saying is that your component knows that something interesting happened, knows that somebody's going to handle it, you know how they're going to handle it, you know how they're going to respond when they handle it correctly, and you know that you then want to do something after that person has already done something. Think of how intelligent now your component is, that it knows exactly what was going to happen as soon as it dispatched that action. It's completely violated the publish-subscribe model. So to the greatest degree possible, if you're going to dispatch an action, let that be the end of it in your component. If you need the component to change its appearance, its representation, or its behavior after it has dispatched an action, then you need to do that via changes to the store through selectors, right? Or represented through selectors. So in other words, you want your component to say, I project a certain part of the state onto my UI. And so if I dispatch an action, the only way I know that my dispatch of that action actually did something interesting to my application is because some piece of state changed in my store, and that state change will cause me to render something differently. But if you need to do an if A or an A then B, right? If you need to do a cause and effect reaction in your component to an action being dispatched, it's a sign either that the component actually does control what's going on, in which case it should not be in the store at all, or it's a sign that your component is doing things that your effects should be doing. You can do navigation in your effects, totally cool. You can show modals in your effects, totally cool. All of these things can be considered and modeled as side effects in your UI. You don't have to go back to the component to do these things. So if you are subscribing to your action stream inside of your components, consider trying to unwind those things. You're going to find that it's going to make your components smaller, simpler, less error prone. It's going to make you feel like NgRx is doing more for you and you're not fighting against it. It's going to just make you happier overall. Again, that's why we talked about publish subscribe. That's why we talked about unidirectional data flow. That's why we talked about coupling. So many of these pieces of advice with regard to NgRx come down to respecting those fundamental architectural principles of NgRx, of Flux, of modern component-based frameworks in order to make sure that you're using things the right way. If you're doing those things, NgRx will be working for you and not against you. The last call that I'll make on this component piece is that you should subscribe to as few, subscribe to the store in as few places as possible in your component tree. Remember back to the unidirectional data flow. A certain parent owns a piece of data and passes it to the people that they need it. It's very tempting and it's very simple to when you need a piece of data out of the store to just get it from a selector and be done with it. But what you're going to do is if in every place that you need a piece of data, you just go get it from a selector, is you're going to create this phantom dependence that you're not going to realize is there. You won't realize that so many of your components actually rely on the same piece of information, but none of them pass it around to each other. They're all silently getting it from some shared third source. And that can oftentimes be confusing. It can also mean that your components are too intelligent. If your components know how to get a piece of data out of the store to fulfill their UI, then what you've just lost my train of thought. Oh, if your components need to all go to the store to get the same pieces of data, instead of being able to pass it back and forth to one another, ultimately, again, you're masking those shared dependencies on that data, and your components are smarter because components that have to go to the store know what's in the store, they know how to get it, they know what that data means, they know what the significance and the context surrounding that data is, and then they have to pull it in. You can make components much simpler, more pure, much more generic, much more reusable if they're given the data that will populate them, as opposed to if they go fetch their own data. That act of having to know what data you need and where to get it is a level of intelligence in the component, which is actually hurting your ability to reuse your components, whether you realize it or not. So wheresoever possible, still leverage unidirectional data flow. You can use a selector in a parent component and then pass that piece of data down to the children and have those children event back to you, and then you dispatch those events back to the store. That is a totally valid pattern, and I think we should be doing that more in our applications. It will make everything a lot simpler. Okay, there was time for one last question, which is from Bad Wolf. How to handle entity collection, which is shared between paged list and the two other components. If I navigate through all the pages of the list, do I have to download all the entities from the database? You know, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question. You know, when I see something like entity collection, obviously my suggestion would be to go look at NgRx entity to see if that's helping you at all. It certainly can help with the complexity of retrieving and storing particular pieces of data. If I navigate through, do I have to download all the entities from the database? I mean, just the idea of downloading all the entities from the database, my first instinct is no, of course not. You wouldn't have to do that. But for everything else, you know, it just really depends on the use case. Certainly, if you still have this question and you're really curious about it, reach out to me on Twitter @RoboCell, and I'd be happy to get more context and see if we can come up with an answer. So that's it for me. If you found this training helpful and you would like to learn more, let us know. We'd love to teach you more. This.labs is now offering virtual corporate trainings of all types, just like this. And so contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. And for any of you that have not already entered or tweeted about this session, don't forget that you can tweet at this.media at Infragistics with the hashtag JavaScript Marathon. Anything that you got out of this session or anything that you enjoyed, and we'll pick somebody to win a free year license to the Ignite UI for Angular. So don't forget to do that. All right, everybody, coming up next is the Vue track, where they're going to be talking about unit testing. So if you're interested at all in Vue, stick around. Otherwise, we will see you next week for more talk about NgRX on this track of JavaScript Marathon. We're going to be talking about unit testing with NgRX. So if you're interested in that, definitely make sure to come back next week. All right, thank you, everybody.